Hey everyone, this video is going to just walk you through some of the basics of Pro Tools. We're not going to get into anything advanced, and we're not going to talk about sound design or all the creative things you can do or would want to do with sound or anything like that. This is really just an intro to the software and kind of understanding the basics of the interface to get you started. So I'm in Pro Tools here, and I'll note that depending what version of Pro Tools you're on, a couple of the things, the windows or the buttons might look a little different, but the same functionality and same processes are going to be there. And also, I'm going to try to shout out keyboard shortcuts where I can. I'm on a Mac. I will also try to give the Windows shortcuts for them. In general, they're the same, except anything that on a Mac you'd push Command, on a Windows you push Control, or if on a Mac you'd push Option, on Windows you push Alt. So I'm in Pro Tools. Let's say I want to start a new session. I'll go to the File menu, Create New, and I'll give it a name. And I do want to point out some of these settings here at the bottom. There are some templates that exist within Pro Tools. They're largely music-based. You can also create your own templates that's more advanced than we're going to get into today. But let's just say I want to create a blank session with nothing already in there. I have file type. AIFF and BWF or WAV are the same audio data. The quality is the same, so it doesn't really matter what you use. If you're working with another software program or bringing something in out of another program that uses one or the other, I would just recommend stay with that one so it doesn't have to do any sort of file conversions or anything like that. And I have my sample rate. 44.1 is standard for like CDs and music. If we're working in post-production, we generally work in 48 or multiples thereof, so we'll go with 48. And I'm going to go with 24-bit depth. You can use 16 will sound fine. That's what's on CDs. 32-bit float is kind of your highest precision. And bit depth is going to have to do with how much dynamic range the samples have. All of these are fine. I'm going to go with 24-bit because when I'm bringing things in out of Avid, that's what Avid is working in. So this way, again, I don't have to convert any files. And it says prompt for location. So I'm going to say create, and it's going to ask me where do I want to put this. And I have to find a place to put it. I would not recommend putting things on the desktop for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes Pro Tools doesn't play nicely with those. In this case, I'm going to put them into my documents folder, and I could make a subfolder in here if I wanted. Just make sure you know where things are going so you can keep track of all your files. So this is an important step to know where it is. So now I've got my Pro Tools session up. And the first thing you're going to see is I don't have any audio or anything in here right now. We're just seeing the basic interface. But I want to point out the two main windows that you're going to work in Pro Tools. And that is the Edit window. You can see up here. This says Edit. And the other window is the Mix window. And I'll zoom back out so we can see that. Right now it's empty because there's nothing in this session yet. But these are the two main windows you're going to be working in. You'll kind of bounce back and forth between them a lot. And so this shortcut is Command equals on a Mac or Control equals if you're on a PC. And that's a great first one to learn because you're going to be bouncing back and forth between those a lot. And you'll see how these work once we have some audio in here. So let's get some audio in here. I could record some audio for now, since again, I'm just trying to demo the basics of the interface. I'm not even going to bother recording. I'm just going to bring in some existing audio. So there's a keyboard shortcut for this, Command-Shift-I or Control-Shift-I on Windows. But I can find this under Import Audio right here. You can see this is also where I go if I want to import a video file, if I'm doing some sound work to picture and I want to bring in a picture reference for it. And I also have Import Session Data, which is useful if you're combining parts of sessions. So I could actually open another Pro Tools session in here and pick what tracks from that Pro Tools session I want to bring into this one. I would use session data for that. Keeping things simple, let's just bring in some audio. I have some audio sitting in a folder here. So here's some sounds. And you'll see if I click on one of these, I can preview it. Some kind of a little foghorn there. Let's preview one more. Okay, so you'll see if I want to, if I don't know what these are, I can listen to them here and I get some information about it, how long it is, what's the bit depth, sample rate. So you see in this case, if this is the audio I'm going to use, I probably could have created different settings on my session because this is an AIFF 1644.1. And I created all these settings differently because those are normally what I work in. These are actually some sounds I just grabbed off CD. I'll go ahead and grab all these, Command A to select all. And I'm going to hit convert because what I want to do is convert them into my projects settings. So it's going to make new versions of these files that are the same file type and bit depth and sample rate as what my session is set to work at. So I'm just going to say convert those, and it'll put them all over here. And I have some choices about how well I want to convert it, really fast or really slow. The slower, theoretically, the better. I'm confirming these started at 44.1. And it's saying where do they want these to go. Now, one nice thing about Pro Tools is once I told it where to put my session, by default, it's going to kind of organize everything for me. So if I don't change anything here, I'll show you where these end up, but they're going to end up in the same place that my session is. That's by default. So I'm just going to hit open here and say, hey, use that default location. And it's doing a conversion here and making all that audio ready to go. And so we'll just skip forward here till that's done. It's only going to take a few seconds. Okay. And those are done. And I'm just going to put these for now in the clip list. You could put them into new tracks, which we'll see what tracks look like in a second. But for the moment, I want to just put them over here in my clip list. And so this is a list of all the audio I have available in this project. And so you can see there's all these sounds here. And it says that they're stereo. And if I click this little drop down, you can see each of those stereo tracks is made up of a left channel and a right channel. So for each of these, I can work with the individual channels or I can work with the stereo. If I go to look where my files went, see here's my session that I created, and it created a folder for that. So we'll talk a little bit about how files are saved and organized in a little bit. But if I open up this folder, you'll see inside it, it has the actual Pro Tools session and has all these other folders that get auto-created. And one of these is called audio files. And inside this is all the audio files that I've added to my session. Now, there are ways to add audio without having it go actually into your session, and the audio ends up stored somewhere else. And there are problems that can happen with that if then you try to move your session somewhere else. But kind of by default, anything I'm going to record directly into my session or import into my session and I have to do a conversion, by default is going to go here. So see, I didn't have to set anything. Once I told it where to save the session, it's automatically creating this folder in here. The other thing you'll notice is for each of those sound effects, so here's audio 1 left, audio 1 right, it actually creates these as individual mono tracks. This is how Pro Tools works. Even if you have a multi-channel, you know, a 5.1 surround session or a regular stereo file, what Pro Tools really likes to work with is these mono files. So it creates those, and when I look in my session, if I have these two files that are labeled the same thing .l and the same thing .r, it understands that those are supposed to be stereo. And so in here, I can work with this as if it's just a stereo file and grab it and play with it and do all sorts of things. But under the hood, it's actually treating each of those as individual mono files. So if you import a stereo file into Pro Tools, you'll actually see it create two separate files if you go and look at the actual file structure. Okay, so now I got some audio in here. And what I need to do is make some place I can do something with them. And these are what's called tracks. So see, I actually have a track menu here, and aside from the command equals or control equals toggle between mix and edit windows, like so. This is another really useful one to learn is the make new track, shift command N or shift control N if you're on Windows, because you'll find something you do fairly often. You'll see I get some options that come up here. And this will look a little different depending on what version of Pro Tools you are on. So I can tell it how many tracks I want to create, and let's keep things simple, but give myself a little room. I'll create 3 tracks, and I can make them mono or stereo. And I'm going to make them stereo because I have some stereo audio to work with. And there are all sorts of different types of tracks you can create. And for this introductory piece, we're just going to stick with audio track. If you get a little more involved in Pro Tools, you're pretty quickly going to find you want to use some of these other ones, some aux-ins, master faders, VCA masters in particular. If you're doing music, maybe some MIDI or instrument tracks, because these all allow you to do some different things. But to keep things simple, we'll just work with audio tracks. And audio tracks are the places where you just put audio. And I'm going to create these in samples. Again, if you're in music, sometimes you'll work in ticks, which would be like the beat if you're doing something to a musical score and measuring things in measures instead of in time code like we usually do in post. I can even type in default names on this version of Pro Tools. And let's say I want some other types of tracks. I can hit this little plus button and make some more things. So I'll make myself 3 stereo tracks and let's say 2 mono tracks just to get started. And so we can be very clear about these. I'll label them stereo and mono. Okay. And so you can see I created 3 stereo tracks. It labeled them stereo 1, stereo 2, stereo 3, 2 mono tracks, mono 1, mono 2. And these now showed up in my edit window. So now I have something to work with. And if I flip over to the mix window, you'll see that now has some stuff here too. So it's important to note the mix and edit windows are really showing you two versions of the same thing. I always have the same tracks here that I have here. Now, sometimes depending on your view, you might have some hidden, so you're not seeing some tracks and you are seeing others. So your views won't always necessarily look exactly the same, showing every single track, but the tracks that ultimately are available in each are the same. So whatever tracks I have here that I can edit, those tracks also exist in the mix window. I'm just looking at two different views of the same track, and I can see some different things I can do with it. And we'll take a look at those in a minute, but that's important to note, is these are just two views of the same thing. If you're used to video editing, it's the same way that you might have a timeline in your editor where you can see the clips sort of laid out in order and see kind of how long each one is and what tracks play where and where there's cuts and stuff like that. And there's another window, a monitor, where you can actually just watch the video play through. And you're seeing the same thing either way. You're seeing your video play the way you've edited it, but in one of them, you're actually watching the video. Another one, you can maybe see a cursor going and showing where the cuts are and where different clips are overlaid and stuff like that. Same kind of thing here. So I'll flip back into my edit window for a second. And once I've got this, now I have some places I can put some audio. So let's say I just want to take one of these sounds and throw it onto a track. I can throw it onto this stereo track here. And by the way, if I don't know what these tracks were, there's a couple ways I can tell what's stereo and what's mono. One way is if I look at the little metering here, you can see the stereo tracks have 2 meters because there's a left meter and a right meter, whereas the mono tracks just have 1 because there's only 1 channel of audio in those. If I go over to the mix window, I can also see there are 2 pan knobs for the stereo tracks because there's, again, 2 pieces of audio. You can see that here. There's the left channel and the right channel in the same track. And so I can pan the left channel one way and I can pan the right channel one way, and I can work with those separately. In the mono tracks where there's just 1 piece of audio, it only gives me 1 panner. And I can also see the same metering down here, that these stereo tracks have 2 meters. You can see there's a little dividing line here. And the mono tracks have 1. Now, if I tried to take something that's a stereo track and move this between different tracks, I could. If I try to move it to a mono track, you'll see it's actually splitting that up, because remember, the stereo track has left audio and right audio, and those are separate. And if I go to a mono track that can only hold 1 piece of audio, now I have the left channel of audio in this track, mono 1, and the right channel of audio in this track in mono 2. So they're separate, and now I can work with them separately. So I could separate these, and now they're not playing in sync with each other anymore. Whereas when they're in here as a stereo track, anything I do affects both because it's treating them the same. I can do some things and pan them independently and such like that, but generally, particularly in the edit window, what I'm working with in a stereo track is going to do the same thing to the left and right. Now, the convenience of that is I don't have to worry about something like this, where if I want to keep these in sync, I have to make sure every time I'm doing something to one, I do it to the other. And if I grab this and accidentally move it over, I'm like, nope, I got to go back and make sure I grab this one too and move them both together. Stereo track keeps me from having to worry about that. So if I have something that I always want to edit these two together, I'd rather have it in a stereo track. If I have something that has a designated left and a designated right that go together, I want that in a stereo track. But if I have something where I just have one recording, or maybe I have 2 channels that were recorded together but aren't necessarily a left and a right. So maybe I was recording some dialogue for a scene on a camera and I had a boom microphone recorded on one channel and a lav mic on the other channel. Well, I don't necessarily want those in stereo. I don't want to hear boom audio out of the left and lav audio out of the right. What I probably wanted was to record both of those tracks, listen to them, and keep the one that sounds good and get rid of the one that doesn't, or maybe mix them together a little bit, but I don't want them to be panned left and right. So I'd probably put those into mono tracks. Let's throw a couple of pieces of audio in here. And just so you can see that we can do it, let me grab one of these mono tracks. So you see I can hit this little drop down here and see the original left and right, and I can throw one of those into one of these mono tracks by itself. So now I just have the left channel of this original stereo track. So now I've got some tracks, I've got some audio in it. Let's take a look at the basics of how we can work with that. Pro Tools works with tools, as you might guess from the name where it says Pro Tools. And I have a list of those here. So I'll go through a couple of these quickly and then talk a little bit more about the ones that we use the most. So the zoom tool is exactly what you would expect. If I turn this, you'll notice now my cursor has turned into a magnifying glass, and I can click on things to zoom in and blow them up. I can hold down Option and zoom back out. I have a scrubber here that I can drag across forward or backwards. So you can see that. And play the audio forward or backwards and kind of hear what it is if I'm listening for something in particular. And I have the pencil tool, which you can use to mess with waveforms. Not a great idea. Most of the time what you use that for is when we're messing with automation, and I'll show that a little bit later. Now notice I have this kind of bracket over these three tools, and that's because these are kind of the three most common and most important ones. In fact, instead of selecting these tools individually, I can actually select the bracket, and you'll see it highlights all of them, and that's what's called the Smart tool. And it's going to allow me to be all three of these tools kind of at the same time. First, let's look at them individually. So this middle one is called the selector, and it's like a cursor. Think of it like in Microsoft Word or something like that. You can see it looks like a cursor. And I can do what I would do with a cursor. I can highlight a section of something. I could highlight sections on multiple tracks if I hold down Shift, or if I kind of drag through this. And I can put where my cursor is. So if I want to play from here, I can click here and hit the space bar to play. And then I want to go back here, hit the space bar to play. And it's playing the audio, and you can see how that works. The hand or grabber tool, you'll see it looks like a hand when I pull it down here. And this is what I'm going to use for grabbing things and moving them around. And you'll see a couple other ways that this is useful, but this is kind of the most basic way to think about it, is just I need to grab something, I need a hand, that's what I'm going to use. And then over here, you'll see that if I hold drop down, there's several different tools within this one. Let me start with the standard. This is called the trim tool, or I sometimes call it the trimmer. And you can see if I go down here, this kind of turns into a bracket. You can see if I'm on the left half of a clip in one of these tracks, it's a left bracket. When I get over to the right half, it switched to a right bracket. And so what I can use this for is to trim things down, and you can see just sort of trimming off the beginning of that, or I can trim off the end of it. Or maybe I trim too much, so I can go back here and trim this back. Now it can't make audio that doesn't exist. If I pull this out to the end of the clip, I can't keep stretching it. That's as long as the clip is. But if that's the whole clip and I had trimmed this down to here, I can trim this out and pick up a little bit more of that stuff. It's very much like trimming in video editing. So I can do that same thing here. So that's the default trim tool. Now it has two other options. One is called TCE, which is time compression expansion. And I'll just note, you want to make sure that you know which of these tools you're in, because they actually do quite different things despite the fact that they're under the same menu options. So if I go to TCE, and let's say I want to stretch this out. So remember here, if I stretch this with the normal trim tool, it's just bringing back that audio that was originally there that I kind of trimmed off of this clip. If I go to the TCE tool and I stretch this out and do the same thing, you'll see it did some processing. And instead of bringing back that audio that was missing, what it did was take this audio that was already here and it stretched it out. It's actually making that same audio take longer to play. Let's bring this down to something a little simpler to look at. So you can see there's kind of this one longer waveform than these two little peaks here. Now if I use the normal trimmer tool, again, it's just bringing audio back that had been cut out. And you can see there's something that kind of looks like it loops a little bit. There's this audio, two peaks, this longer piece, two peaks, this longer piece, two peaks. Okay. If I go back to the time compression expansion tool and do the same thing, you'll see it just kept that long piece of audio and then two peaks. It didn't bring back any audio. It's just playing the same piece over a longer period. It's stretching it out. So it's doing something very different. So again, I want to make sure I know which I'm in. I can also do the same thing. If I want that to play faster, I can shrink this down. You'll see it's got that same sort of shape to the waveform. It's just shrunk it down so it goes faster. And the last one here is the loop tool. So if I like this piece of audio I've got here, and I just want to keep looping it, this is something that you would use more commonly if you're working with music. So maybe you get kind of a little drum beat that you like and you want to loop it through something. We don't use it a ton in video post-production, but just to show you what it does, I can stretch this out here and you'll see it's just looping that same exact piece of audio however long I stretch this out. So it's got this longer chunk of waveform, two peaks, this longer chunk, two peaks, this longer chunk, two peaks. And you can see there's a little loop icon here, that little arrow showing you every time it loops. So it actually plays through this whole clip, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then a little bit more times. So that's what the loop tool does. So let's go back to my standard trimmer here. And the shortcuts for these are handy to know. It's F6 for the trim tool, F7 for the selector tool, F8 for the grabber tool. And if you want the smart tool that's all three of them, I can just sort of mash F6, F7, and F8 all together, and it highlights all those. And once I'm in this tool, you can see depending on where I put my cursor, it changes. So if I'm on the bottom half of a clip, it's the hand tool, the grabber. If I'm on the top half, it changes to the selector. And if I get near the edge of a clip, it becomes the trimmer. So this is a way to kind of all of those at your disposal at once. If you're precise with your mouse movements, this can be great. If you're a little more klutzy like me, I usually like to just have active the one that I want to use so I don't accidentally use the wrong one, but principle's the same. So F6, F7, F8, these actually do all the tools. So I have F5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there's F5, F9, and F10. So all these tools are immediately accessible. Over here to the left of those tools, I have some zoom settings. And if I hover over this, you can see it tells me what it is. Horizontal zoom out on the left, horizontal zoom in on the right. These are, I think, kind of a little awkward to get used to if you encounter them for the first time, just kind of knowing what to do. But basically, this is zoom out. I want to see things kind of shrunk down. So if you look up my time code up here, you can see now I'm seeing 32 minutes, 34, 36 minutes worth. If I zoom in, now I'm just seeing 20 seconds worth across this timeline. The return key will take me back to the beginning of my sessions. If I hit that, I can get back here. These in the middle are vertical zoom. So for instance, if my waveforms are just kind of too small to see in this view, I can stretch them out like this, like that, if I want the waveforms to be bigger or smaller. Now it's important to note this is not changing the volume. This is just changing my view. So it's not like when I make these waveforms bigger, I'm making them louder. I'm just adjusting the view, and you can see over here on each track there's a little scale kind of showing what you're seeing, and as I zoom the waveforms, that scale changes. As I zoom out, you can see now it's cramming each waveform into just this size, so I have a lot of wasted space. That's why these look small. So we can zoom in on those a little bit to use a little bit more of that space. There are also zoom presets, so these are predetermined amounts to be zoomed in that I can click and get to. And then lastly, over here on the far left are my sort of edit modes: shuffle, spot, slip, and grid. And as you're getting started, my suggestion would be most of the time you're probably in slip, which is what you kind of expect how an editor would work. So I can kind of move clips wherever I want. If I go into grid mode, it's going to put in a grid, and zoom in a little here, you can see the grid, and you'll notice things don't move smoothly. They sort of jump to those points. So this can be handy if I want things to occur, exactly on beats if I'm working with music and I have the grid timed to tick marks, or if I'm working in post and I had it timed to frame lines and I want certain clips to go right at the start of a frame line or something like that. Or if I want to move something an exact amount, like I want to move this back exactly 3 frames because I know I'm going to do some editing and cut out 3 frames later or whatever, I could go into grid mode and do this that way. So it's still letting me kind of move things where I want, but not to any specific spot. I can move them depending on what the grid is set to in exact increments of that. So in this case, the grid is set to 1 second. So I can move things exactly 1 second at a time. If I want to change it, let's go to time code, and I could say I want to be able to move things 1 frame at a time. I'm pretty zoomed out here, so it's hard to see that. If I zoom in, now you can see moving 1 frame at a time. Boom, boom. Spot mode, I'm not even going to get into for these basics. That's a whole nother thing, but useful sometimes when you're recording. Shuffle mode is good to note. So let me show you the difference between slip and shuffle. Let's say I have 2 clips here and I'm pretty zoomed out. Okay, right now in slip mode, I can move things wherever I want. So I can take this and put it and leave a little gap here or a little bigger gap, or I could actually overlap part of this. If I go into shuffle mode, shuffle is going to move things to exactly line up with each other and kind of not leave gaps. So I don't accidentally, if I'm in slip mode, maybe I want these things to be right up against each other, but in fact, if we zoom in here, I left a little gap here of a couple seconds. If I go into shuffle mode and I move this a little bit, you can see it's going to jump right up and exactly be at the end of that other clip. But in this case, if I say, I actually want to move this way back here, it's not going to let me. It's only going to let me leave things where they are or move them to exactly line up with something else. So you can see if I move this up to this track, it immediately jumps. I want to be at the end of that, or right at this cut point here, or at the start of the session. So you don't have that same freedom to move things exactly wherever you want. It's going to limit you to putting things exactly up against cuts. There are times that's really handy, right? I'm kind of zoomed out here and I'm like, okay, I know I want this to be right butted up against the clip in front of it. I could zoom way in and look at that, or I could just go into shuffle mode and kind of drag this a little bit and I know it's coming right there. So it definitely has its uses. When you're getting started out, my recommendation is most of the time start in slip mode because it just gives you the freedom to kind of move things exactly where you want and not worry about how things are shuffling around, which I should note is the other problem with shuffle mode. Let's say, let me throw a couple of clips in here. Let's say I had something like this and I decide to move this clip like this. You can see I can just move it around, or actually maybe I even want to move it down to this track. I can kind of do that however I want. If I'm in shuffle mode, as you'd expect, I can move this right up against this clip in front of it. But if I move it to another track, you'll see it took that block of space out of this track above and shifted this whole thing forward. So you have to be really careful in shuffle mode because if you move things around in certain ways, it's going to affect everything later than that on the track as well. So if you look again, this clip here is starting about 725. And now I move this down here and it moved this whole thing up and now it's starting at 520. So it moved something a couple minutes without me intending to. So again, shuffle mode you just want to be careful with, as opposed to slip mode where I'm only affecting what I'm actually moving intentionally. There are shortcuts for all of these. If you remember, the tools are F5, F6, F7, F8, F9, F10. Those first 4 F keys are reserved for these, so I can go F1, F2, F3, F4, and switch through all those. So F2 always gets me back to slip mode, F1 back to shuffle mode. So I have that option. Those are the basics of your tools and kind of moving things around in here. A couple last kind of intro to Pro Tools interface sort of things. If I have my selector tool, I can select areas of things. Let's say I like this particular chunk of sound. I could do Command R just to make a region. And let's just call this a cool sound. And you'll notice that showed up over here in my clips list. It says cool sound. Now it didn't make a new file of that. It knows that that chunk is part of this. If you're familiar with picture editing, this would be kind of like what we'd call a subclip. It's not making a new file, but it's remembering that particular part. But then later on, I'm like, oh, where was that cool sound I had? I can go over here, grab that cool sound, and kind of use it as if it's its own file. Use it as its own clip, and you can see the waveform looks the same as this part that I grabbed here. Also in selector tool mode, if I need to split something, I can just click at the point where I want to split it. So let's say I want to split this clip here. Command E will split it in two, and now I can work with those two halves independently. I can also access this under the Edit menu, Separate Clip at Selection. You can see there's that Command E shortcut, and that gives me these. And if I want to rename a clip, so let's say this piece here I want to name something else, I can double click it and give it a name. Say clip that I'm using. Obviously give them better names that reflect what the audio actually is. I'm just sort of demonstrating. Now that was in that case a region. And you can see just like cool sound, it showed up here. It's not a whole file. It's not its own file on the hard drive somewhere. It's just remembering that kind of subclip. If I do this with an actual entire clip, so if I grab this whole thing that I have not edited, this is the entirety of sfx.audio 05, and I double click on that, you'll see it actually gives me, do you want to just change the name of the clip, or do you actually want to change the name of that file on the disk? Because this is an original file that you're dealing with here. And I could do that and change the actual file itself to look like that. So you can see here's that sound that I just changed, and now it actually changed the file name to Sound Effect 5, although it's still left and right separate parts. So those are my basic editing options. And the last thing I'll show you over here in the edit window is track view. Right now, all these tracks are showing the waveform view. I'm looking at the waveform, but I have other things I could see. So for instance, let's say I want to see the volume on that track. You can see there's this line, and if you'll notice, it changes from this sort of 5-finger out hand to kind of a pointer finger, and that's going to allow me to put keyframes on this. So I can adjust the volume on this track, and whatever's on this track will then follow that volume curve. So kind of starts at its default 0 level. 0 not meaning no volume, meaning I haven't made any changes, and then it starts getting quieter, then it slowly gets even quieter, and then as this clip's playing, it's getting louder again. So, you know, if we just sort of stretch this out here to hear what that sounds like, I'm going to hit S to solo that track, meaning I only want to hear what's on this track. And you can hear as it's playing, it's getting louder because of what I did with the volume automation there. And if I wanted it to get back quieter again, I could do that. So now it would come up, get loud, and then get quiet again. So I can do that with volume. I can adjust the pans and so on and so forth. The other way I can affect volume on a clip level instead of on a track level, because you notice when I did this, this is affecting the original track. It kind of doesn't matter what audio is in here. So I could take another clip and throw it in there, and it would get that volume automation or volume keyframe put on it. If I want to affect the volume of a clip, I can grab this little slider here that's on the lower left of every clip in my session and make it louder or make it softer. And you'll notice the waveform is changing, but this is not a zoom. You'll notice it's only changing on this clip. This is actually showing me this is getting louder or softer as I adjust this. So that's a quick way to adjust the volume on an individual clip. Let's pop over to the mix window for a second. And you can see I have some of the same controls. It still knows that this track is soloed, meaning I'm just hearing this one. These other tracks are temporarily muted because I'm just listening to this one. That's what this sort of faded orange means. If I actually want to hard mute a clip and say, I don't want to hear this track at all, I can hit the mute button and that track will not be heard now, regardless of whether I solo other things. In fact, even if I solo that track, I still won't hear it because it's muted. But when you solo one track, you can see it kind of does a temporary mute to the other tracks. That's what that faded orange is telling you. Down here, if you've ever been in a recording studio, you might have seen a physical object that looked like this, like a mixing console with these little sliders that I can move up and down to adjust the volume. And you notice this one has already been adjusted. That's because, remember, this is always showing me the same thing as the edit window. And on that first track, I told the volume to go down for this section that we're at now. And so if we were to play this clip and go over here, you'll see it showing me visually what that volume automation was doing. Remember, I made this clip get louder, go all the way up to the top here, and then it's going to get softer again. And so you can see just the same thing that I'm seeing with this blue line here is what this is doing. And I can do that with other tracks as well. So say I threw this on a volume mute. Right now it's on 0. If I took this whole track and said, let's pull this down to -21, you'll notice this point has been pulled down from where it was. Before it was up here. And now it's come down here because of what I did on the mix window. Something else dealing with volume, if I don't want a clip to kind of just hard cut in at the beginning and end, is I can do a little fade on it. So I can highlight an area here, hit Command F, and it's going to let me do a fade, and you'll see there's actually all sorts of different types of fades that I can do, and I can adjust those to be however I want if I'm really particular about my fades. Now it's going to fade in the audio there, and I can fade it out again at the end. I could also use this to do a sort of dissolve. So if I put two clips overlaying each other and I want to sort of smoothly transition from one to another, just like in video editing, I could put a dissolve between the two, hit Command F again, and it's going to gradually fade from one to the other. Last thing I want to show you here is Audio Suite, and I'm not going to get into all the details on this, just show you it exists as you're getting started in Pro Tools. And so let's say a little piece of audio here, just kind of this tone, and I want to do something to it, some sort of processing. There are different ways to do this within Pro Tools, but the simplest way when you're getting started out is to just use Audio Suite here, and you can see all these different sort of processing things I could do to it. So for instance, let's say I just want to pitch shift it. Use the Pitch 2 plugin, and I'll just shift it down a bunch there. Make sure Use in Playlist is turned on if I want it to actually show up in my session here. I'll hit render. So remember, this sounded like this. Now I've pitch shifted this part of it down, so it's lower. Let's do one more. I'll pitch shift this part higher. So it went from this to this. And you can see when I did those, it actually created new files for those. That's what it was rendering, is it actually created a new clip. There's a new piece of audio, a new file on my computer that's that piece of audio pitch shifted. There's the one I shifted down first. The second one, there's the one I shifted up. And if I go back into my Finder, you can see it has created some new audio files. All sorts of different types of processing you can do within Audio Suite. All you got to do is select the chunk of audio that you want to do it to. So I can select with my cursor tool like that, or I could use my grabber and just click on a clip if I want to do the whole thing. And then I select the particular processor I want to do. I set whatever options I want for it, and then I'll hit render to actually create that. And that is the basics of Pro Tools. Like I said, there's so much more you can get into with this, and we haven't touched on any of the sort of creative aspects, but that's the basics of the interface. And if you do that, you can work in Pro Tools and start editing some sound and adjusting their volumes and so on and so forth like that. When I'm done, I'm going to save my session. And just a reminder of how it saves this. So wherever I told it to save my session, in this case in my documents folder, it's going to create a folder for that. And if I grab this folder, I'm going to have everything I need for this session, because inside that folder is the actual Pro Tools session, which is small. You can see this is 62K. That's just the information about how should this audio be arranged in here, and where did I have some keyframes put in. It's basically all the information about how to put the session together. It's not any actual audio, because all the audio is built up out of these audio files. Again, it is possible to end up with audio that's in your session but does not show up in this folder. But by default, when you import things in and it has to convert them, or if you do any actual recording into your session, by default, it's all going to end up here. If I want to be really sure I have all my audio, and this is a good thing to do if you're about to move your session from one computer to another or back it up, and you just want to make sure you have everything, here's how you do that. I'm going to go into File and say Save Copy In. So I'm saying I want to save a copy of my whole project somewhere. And it'll actually let me change some of these settings if I wanted to. And here's the important thing. I'm going to check this box that says Audio Files. That's going to take whatever audio files are used in this session, regardless of where they originally came from or where they live on my computer, and it's going to make a new copy of them and put them with this copy of the project that I'm saving. So even if I had some files that somehow didn't end up in here because I, just dragged and dropped them in from somewhere else and it didn't actually make a copy in Pro Tools, or I'm referencing something that was from another program or whatever, it's going to make copies of all those in the one place, and so then I'll have a full copy of my session to move. This is really important if you're going to be moving stuff from computer to computer, making sure that you have all the audio files that your Pro Tools session needs to work. So I'll do that. I'll hit OK. It's going to ask me where I want to save it. And let's put this one in Documents as well. I'll just leave the name Copy of My Test Session. You can see it made a copy of it here, and inside there is the Pro Tools session and all of those audio files. So I've got everything I need now. And just show you, if I close this session and open up that new one, they'll look exactly the same because it's an exact copy of that session. See, it's got the same windows, same audio files and regions and stuff labeled over here. But this way I know if I go and grab this and copy it onto an external drive and move it to another computer or archive it somewhere, I've got everything I need to pick back right up where I left off is right there. So that's your basics of Pro Tools. When you're done, if you're done completely, you can always quit Pro Tools. I will make a quick note, depending on what kind of Pro Tools system you're on and what the hardware is, sometimes it takes a long time to load up. So it's good to know this shortcut, close session. So if I was working one Pro Tools session and let's say I'm in a lab scenario and somebody else is coming in right after me and working on a different session, instead of quitting Pro Tools and having to wait for the whole thing to boot up again, I can just close my session, Command Shift W, and sure, save my changes. And it didn't quit Pro Tools, and they can come right in and open their session and pick up where they left off. So that's your intro to Pro Tools. Hope that was helpful and gives you all the information you need to get started working in Pro Tools. Good luck.